Oil, the lifeblood of modern civilization. It powers our cars, heats our homes, and fuels our industries. The United States is one of the largest oil producers in the world, but paradoxically, it can't use all the oil it produces. Why is this the case? The U.S. does indeed produce enough barrel to meet its own needs. In 2020, the U.S. produced 18.4 million barrels of oil daily while consuming 18.12 million barrels. However, despite this, the country still imports 7.86 million barrels of oil daily. This situation arises due to a mix of economic and chemical reasons. Economically, importing oil can be cheaper than domestically produced oil, even after accounting for shipping costs. This is largely due to lifting costs, or the expenses involved in extracting oil from the ground, often lower in other countries. Factors like land and lease prices, labor costs, and environmental regulations also influence these costs. Additionally, some countries use oil exports as a strategic tool, offering oil at lower prices to exert geopolitical influence. Russia, for instance, has been accused of using energy supply as a political weapon. However, the main reason the U.S. continues to import oil despite its production capacity is due to the type of oil it produces. Crude oil is classified by weight and sweetness, which refers to sulfur content. The U.S. primarily produces light, sweet crude, which is easier to refine. However, much of the country's refining infrastructure is set up to handle heavier, sour crude, which has higher sulfur content. This setup dates back to when imported oil, which tends to be heavier and less sweet, met most of the U.S.'s energy needs. Over the past 150 years, the United States has played a crucial role in the global oil industry. Initially, the U.S. drilled and consumed most of its oil, leading the world in oil usage. However, by the late 1930s, substantial oil reserves were discovered in other parts of the world, especially in the Middle East. These nations began extensive drilling operations, which gradually changed the global oil landscape. While the U.S. initially relied minimally on imported oil, its growing demand for transportation and industrial needs outstripped domestic production capacity, leading to increased reliance on foreign oil. This dependency became starkly apparent during the 1973 oil crisis. The geopolitical landscape shifted dramatically when the U.S. supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War, prompting Saudi Arabia and other Arabian oil exporters to impose an oil embargo on the U.S. The embargo led to widespread fuel shortages, empty gas stations, and enforced energy conservation measures, exposing the vulnerability of the U.S. to international oil supply disruptions. In response, President Nixon implemented policies such as banning U.S. oil exports and proposing the construction of 1,000 nuclear power plants by the year 2000. However, this ambitious goal fell short, with only 54 nuclear plants constructed. Despite these efforts, the U.S. continued to struggle with its oil needs and increasingly turned to imports, especially from Canada and Middle Eastern countries. By the late 1990s, it was evident that, while the U.S. possessed significant oil reserves, much of it was in unconventional formations like shale, which required advanced extraction techniques like hydraulic fracturing. Fracking, though an old technique, saw revolutionary advancements in the late 1990s, thanks to the efforts of George Mitchell and his team. They developed a method combining a water-based mixture and horizontal drilling, which unlocked vast quantities of oil and natural gas trapped in shale formations. This innovation led to a dramatic surge in U.S. oil production. By 2015, the U.S. lifted its oil export ban, further increasing production and exports. However, the increased production did not simplify the situation. Despite producing significant amounts of oil, much of it was exported because domestic refineries were designed to process different types of oil than what was predominantly produced through fracking. This created a complex web of oil imports and exports. For instance, West Coast refineries, such as Chevron's El Segundo refinery, import oil from various countries because their infrastructure and configurations are not suited for the type of oil produced domestically. This mismatch results in substantial oil imports even as the U.S. exports its oil. Achieving true energy independence poses significant economic and logistical challenges. It would require massive investments in refining infrastructure and a re-evaluation of environmental standards, which currently make such investments risky. As a result, the U.S. focuses on energy security, ensuring a reliable supply of energy from friendly and stable sources like Canada, rather than striving for complete independence. In the long term, the transition to cleaner energy and reducing dependency on fossil fuels remains a critical goal. The U.S. aims to balance energy security with environmental sustainability, moving towards a future where reliance on oil diminishes and renewable energy sources take precedence. While navigating the complexities of the oil industry, the broader objective remains to secure a sustainable and secure energy future. Furthermore, Vladimir Putin's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine has significantly disrupted the global fossil fuel market. In response, the United States and its allies have implemented severe sanctions against Russia. A notable measure from President Joe Biden involves banning the import of Russian oil, natural gas, and coal into the United States. Given the international energy market's long-standing dependence on fossil fuels, this ban could lead to higher gasoline prices for American consumers and potential supply disruptions for European countries. To address this issue effectively, there is an urgent need to transition to clean energy, rather than increasing leasing, drilling, or investing in the volatile fuel sources that have precipitated the current energy crisis. Despite aggressive and misleading public relations efforts by the oil and gas industry to promote increased drilling as a viable policy solution, the United States is already the world's largest producer of oil and gas. Currently, domestic oil production stands at 90% of the pre-pandemic peak, with the U.S. producing more than twice the number of barrels per day compared to 2008. However, true energy independence cannot be achieved through fossil fuels. Reliance on a resource that is controlled by the global market and subject to manipulation by autocratic regimes makes energy independence unattainable. The fossil fuel industry's demands for more taxpayer subsidies, expanded drilling rights, and reduced environmental and health regulations will not alleviate the immediate burden of high gasoline prices. Moreover, granting these requests will commit the United States to decades of elevated and unstable energy costs, increased toxic emissions, and greater climate damage. The United States must pursue genuine energy security by reducing its dependence on fossil fuels and accelerating the transition to clean energy sources. This approach will not only stabilize energy prices, but also safeguard the environment and public health for future generations. For example, when geopolitical situations arise, such as the decision to ban imports from Russia, the U.S. must turn to countries like Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and Iran to fill the gap. This dependency is not the fault of any single politician, but rather a result of a broader systemic issue involving politicians and oil executives over the past several decades. The history of U.S. energy consumption is a tale of dramatic changes and persistent challenges, spanning from the oil boom of the 1980s to the rise of renewable energy in the 2020s. Here's a summary of this journey. Our story begins in the mid-1800s, during the Industrial Revolution, when coal was the primary energy source. However, the discovery of kerosene from crude oil offered a new lighting fuel alternative to whale oil, whose supplies were dwindling. In 1859, Colonel Edwin L. Drake drilled the first successful oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania, sparking a regional oil rush. This new drilling method paved the way for the establishment of the first U.S. oil refinery in 1861 and the country's initial shipment of refined oil to London. Over the next 150 years, oil would eclipse coal as a dominant energy source, propelling the United States into a position of economic power. By 1880, the United States produced 85% of the world's crude oil and refining output, with kerosene becoming the fourth largest U.S. export. However, U.S. dominance in European and Asian markets faced competition from new oil discoveries under British, Dutch, and Russian control. Major oil finds in California, Oklahoma, and Texas, including the significant Spindletop Gusher in 1901, bolstered U.S. production. This period also saw the rise of oil byproducts, from stove fuel to lubricants for machinery, integrating oil into everyday life. Henry Ford's introduction of the Model T in 1908 revolutionized transportation, making automobiles accessible to the masses. By 1910, gasoline had surpassed kerosene as the primary use of oil in the United States, cementing the nation's lead in car ownership. Meanwhile, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil controlled 90% of U.S. refineries and pipelines. However, in 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered its breakup under antitrust laws, leading to the formation of companies like Chevron, Exxon, and Mobil, which would dominate the global oil market for decades. World War I highlighted the strategic importance of oil, as U.S. supplies were vital for the Allied war effort. German attacks disrupted oil exports, leading to shortages in Britain and France, while the U.S. increasingly relied on oil imports from Mexico. Post-war, concerns about depleting oil reserves led to the first American fears over oil security. The U.S. Geological Survey warned that domestic supplies might run out within a decade, prompting legislative measures like the Mineral Leasing Act of 1920 to secure energy resources. In response to British and French attempts to exclude U.S. companies from Middle Eastern oil, the United States pushed for an open-door policy, allowing free competition for foreign oil concessions. This led to the Red Line Agreement, where major oil companies, including American ones, agreed to share interest in the Iraq Petroleum Company. The 1930s brought technological advances and overproduction, leading to oil price crashes. In 1933, the U.S. government imposed production quotas and tariffs on imported oil to stabilize the market, a practice that continued even after the federal system was overturned. The global landscape shifted as countries like Mexico nationalized their oil industries, setting a precedent for others. Meanwhile, during World War II, the U.S. leveraged its oil production to support the Allies, while imposing an embargo on Japan that contributed to tensions leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor. In 1945, President Franklin D. Roosevelt met with Saudi King Abdul Aziz, marking the beginning of a crucial U.S.-Saudi oil relationship. This partnership would become pivotal as Saudi Arabia discovered vast oil reserves, positioning it as a leading global exporter. After World War II, the U.S. experienced a post-war boom, with a surge in automobile ownership driving increased oil consumption. The Marshall Plan also facilitated European recovery, partly through U.S. oil exports. The 1973 oil crisis, triggered by the Arab-Israeli conflict, resulted in an oil embargo by Arab nations against the U.S. and its allies. This led to widespread fuel shortages and price spikes, highlighting the vulnerabilities of U.S. energy dependence. In response, the U.S. government implemented various energy conservation measures, established the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and created the Department of Energy. Despite these efforts, oil consumption continued to rise, culminating in the second oil shock following the Iranian Revolution in 1979. The 1997 Kyoto Protocol aimed to reduce emissions, but the U.S. did not ratify it, facing criticism for its climate policy. Major oil company mergers in the late 1990s and early 2000s raised concerns about competition and gas prices. Venezuela and Russia emerged as key oil players, using their resources as geopolitical tools. By 2004, Canada became the top U.S. oil exporter, surpassing Saudi Arabia due to increased oil sands production. The Energy Policy Act of 2005 promoted renewable fuels and flex fuel vehicles, aiming to reduce oil dependency. Oil prices soared to $147 per barrel from 2006 to 2008, driven by global demand and market speculation. The 2007 Act raised fuel efficiency standards and promoted biofuels, setting ambitious goals for energy independence. The 2010 BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico led to a temporary offshore drilling ban and highlighted the need for reduced consumption. Libya's 2011 conflict spiked global oil prices, affecting markets even though Libya did not export oil to the U.S. The Paris Agreement, signed in 2015, set global climate targets, marking a significant shift towards a sustainable energy future. President Trump's 2017 America First energy policy expanded drilling and reduced regulations to boost domestic production. In 2020, U.S. oil production peaked at 13 million barrels per day, but the COVID-19 pandemic caused a price drop and production cuts. In 2021, under President Biden, the focus shifted to renewable energy, with a renewed commitment to the Paris Agreement and goals for emission reductions. In 2022, U.S. oil exports soared to new heights, solidifying the country's role as a major oil supplier amidst global tensions. By 2023, the U.S. invested heavily in renewable technologies, aiming to reduce fossil fuel reliance and address climate change. As we look ahead, the evolution of U.S. energy consumption continues, reflecting a complex history of challenges and advancements towards a sustainable future.